All right. A very good morning to you all. Welcome to the third day of the Nobel Symposium. My name is Elina. Amadhila. I'm from Windhoek. I'm at the University of Namibia. I will be the chair for this session this morning on agriculture. All right, so before I start, I would like to start off with a quote by Thomas Jefferson that says, "Agriculture is our wisest pursuit because it will, in the end, contribute most to real wealth, good morals, and happiness." And I thought I should start with that quote because just think about, ever since the first day we came here, we've been fed, there's been food. And I think that has contributed a little to our happiness. I don't think we'll be happy without food, yeah? But all that comes from agriculture, right? So it's in the end contributes to whatever else that we do, the wealth that we want to build. But I'm not the speaker, so we will have the first speaker this morning. That's Tavneet Suri from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And then that's from 9 o'clock to 9:30, and then Respondent will be Karen Macours from Paris School of Economics, and then Alemayehu from International Food Policy Research Institute. Thank you. Tavneet, your floor.
Thanks, Elina. I'm also going to start with a quote, just not as deep or fundamental as Elina's, I'm afraid. I wanted to start on a different note, reminded by something Amy Poehler said, which was, surround yourself by people who challenge you and inspire you and spend a lot of time with them, and it'll change your life. Some of the people in this room have challenged me. Oh boy, have they challenged me. Some have inspired me, and a few have done both. You know, given the last few days, I was hoping that this would be a chance for me to see a lot of you in this room who have spoken over the last few days and today challenge and inspire a different generation of people. And that didn't quite happen. So I'm going to challenge you today and say, you know, maybe we can do a rinse and repeat where you do get to challenge and inspire a whole host of people, where maybe they will challenge and inspire you in some ways. As you know, the policy conversation yesterday really did a bit of that for me. And I think it would be great to see us all do a bit more of that and probably or hopefully live up to the aspirations of titles behind me in some way. So that's my challenge to you. I'm going to move to the topic at hand, which is agriculture. And what I'm going to do today is basically actually go through what Chris already mentioned in the first day of this, which was our VoxDev Lit. We have a VoxDev Lit coming out on agriculture, well, the second version coming out next week. And so I'm going to basically base this on that because the instructions from the organizers were to do exactly what we do in the Lit. So Chris and I co-edit as senior editors of the VoxDev Lit, and I'm going to try and give a shout out to all the co-editors on it. So a big thanks to Jenny, Lauren, Michael, Lorenzo, who's in the room, Robert, Doug, Vivian, Tom, Noreen, Harunan, Jeremy, Hope, Meredith, and Amelia. I managed. So a big shout out to them. This is all based on all of our joint work. And I'm going to talk about why, where, when, how, and what next, if I can get through all of that in 30 minutes. And like other talks, this has been pretty typical now. I'm going to start with some trends. And I'm going to show you agriculture share of GDP worldwide and the agriculture share of employment worldwide and split up by regions. And you can see it's a large part of GDP for a lot of the developing world. It's also an extremely large share of employment. Okay, so teeing up what Elina used as a quote, I think this fits that picture. In the developing world, this is a big part of economies. Okay, so much as it's a big part of these economies, GDP and employment-wise, if we look at productivity or measures of productivity, this is serial yield value across these regions, some of the developing world is lagging behind. Okay, and there's a huge, huge difference across these regions. So productivity varies dramatically across the world. It also varies dramatically within countries in these regions. Okay, and Chris and Doug have a paper showing this pretty dramatic difference in yields between the 5th and the 95th percentile within country. So this is not just a picture in averages across countries, but also within countries quite a lot. So one of the big questions has been what explains those sorts of trends? Okay, what's going on? And some of this and some of the productivity differences is certainly the use of fertilizer worldwide. So you can see this on the left, or at least on my left as I'm pointing, and the share of land equipped with irrigation. Okay, so some of these differences are explained by input uses like fertilizers and irrigation. And it's going to tee up kind of where this literature has been. So this is what I'm going to try and do over the next 25 minutes. The literature is really focused on trying to understand these trends and what drives these trends. Okay, so the why is productivity lower in some parts of the world than others? Technology use has stagnated in some parts of the world, mostly Africa. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is based on research on the continent. And people have tried to ask, why is this? What's happening? And what prevents people from using supposedly productive technologies? Then I'll talk a bit about when and where and heterogeneity. And Chris really teed me up very nicely to do this with his talk on Tuesday. Where and when is productivity high? Do we have any cases where it is high? When and where is technology use high, and why? And then I'll try and do two big pieces if I can, which is how can policy help? How should we think about policy given what we've learned so far? And what are open questions in agriculture? Okay, so that's the plan for today. So let me start with the why. The why is huge. This is going to be something that's very different about agriculture than the rest of the topics we've seen. The literature is absolutely enormous. I will not cite individual papers because there's just too many, really, mostly in this area, especially under the why. And most of what I've cited up there is all Africa-based work. So I'm not even including South Asia or Southeast Asia or any of that. Okay, and I'm already running out of space on the slide. So people have studied every aspect of why that they can think of. Okay, and so I'm going to go through a few of them quickly. One is credit, liquidity, and savings constraints. Okay, so this is all kind of financial tools and instruments, stuff Emily talked about. And in general, like from all these papers, the one thing we learn is it does a little, they matter a little, but not so much. Okay, they're not solving the difference between Africa and the rest of the world. They get us, a small share of the way there, but it's small. Insurance constraints, lots of work on insurance constraints in different parts of Africa as well. These seem to matter a lot more, but figuring out how to solve them, not so easy. We've heard about Lorenzo's work, and Chris and Dean also have work there. And still thinking about how best to think about products in this space that will help farmers even more than the current set of products do. Knowledge constraints has been a big, big part of the literature, trying to understand whether people know about new technologies and use them. And this seems to, again, be a small part of the puzzle at best. Okay? It seems to be that the only time they matter is when it's a really new thing, like a brand new technology, not one that's been around for a while, or there's some complexity around it in some way. People have thought about labor market imperfections. Here, the literature is actually quite small. It's the one constraint which has been really hard for people to think through and work through. And so there's a little bit of work showing that labor market imperfections are really important here. How to solve them? Still, we don't know in general, but people have shown that this tends to be somewhat of a binding constraint. And when I talk about some of the later literature, you'll see why as well. And then there's been a bunch of work, a lot of it much more recent, on limited market access. So this is poor infrastructure, high transport costs. And these seem to matter quite a bit. There's lots of work showing that there is poor infrastructure, transport costs are high, and this can also create versions of market power in different ways, and market power also matters, shockingly, right? There's limited markets for quality. Again, a very recent literature here trying to understand if we can give farmers incentives for quality upgrading, and that's a way to move up the value chain. There was a bit of a conversation around value chain stuff yesterday, including in the policy panel. This is kind of our first step at trying to think about what value chains mean, but a very small one. But trying to think, can we get quality upgrades? Some of that literature is also around kind of things like aflatoxins in maize and worrying about sort of health consequences of poor quality. And then I'll quickly mention land market imperfections, which again, the literature is a little smaller. And there's a lot on property rights, for example, but a lot less on markets for land. Lorenzo is one of the exceptions on there. The land markets and the poor infrastructure, one of the things some of these papers are finding is these interact with labor markets pretty dramatically. So there's work now on rental markets for, think of tractors, things like this, big equipment rental markets. These are starting to grow, especially in South Asia. But people find that a lot of these investments are not as productive as they might be because they're interacting with a labor constraint. Right? There's a nice paper by Jeremy Magruder on irrigation in Rwanda showing that you can build irrigation investments, but if you can't get the labor that you need to make that irrigation investment productive, then you kind of do very marginal things with it. Okay? And so a lot of these things are going to interact with the others. Something Emily said about finance, or I think maybe Dean said about finance. I might have mixed that up. But we're going to see the same sort of thing here. So as you can see, large literature on the why. And I think what we end up finding or saying is there's no single binding constraint. We wish it was one thing that explained the world and we could just fix it, but the world tends not to work that way. Okay? Different combinations of constraints bind, but different combinations bind for different farmers. Okay? And this makes the world quite complex. It also means maybe packages of interventions might be more useful. Right? Think of the ultra-poor programs that people talked about on Tuesday. That's a package. So maybe in agriculture, we need to think that way. There's some examples of packages, and I've listed those there. But it's a pretty small literature. And so lots and lots of work to do here to think about how do we bundle things or how do we package things to really try to make change on the why question. And hopefully the why leads to productivity gains, of course. Okay. We keep saying bundled and multifaceted programs. They're far from a silver bullet themselves either. We had a program in the 70s and the 80s called the Integrated Rural Development Programs, which kind of were not exactly successful. There's some community-driven development programs that haven't worked that well. And sometimes the costs are just too high. Okay? And I'll talk about that a bit later as well. We do know that farmers do overcome constraints when the technology is sufficiently productive, sufficiently profitable, okay? And there's some examples there of cases where we see this. But this notion of sufficiently productive or sufficiently profitable is kind of very localized. It's limited to a very small geographic extent, a social extent, an economic extent, okay? And so we have to kind of think about how do we envision those or the set of technologies that would provide these opportunities, and it's not going to be the same one everywhere. I think that leads me nicely into the where and the when. So one thing we do know, and this is not just from economics, but actually from the notion of crops, agriculture technologies are very sensitive to local circumstances, right? Nutrients matter, moisture matters, soil quality matters, altitude matters, right? There's some crops that just don't grow at low altitudes. Soil matters, sun matters, all of it matters. And that's a natural source of heterogeneity out there that will make any technology more or less profitable depending on the interaction of all these things, right? And then if I put over this the economics, right? That's not economics yet. If I put over this the economics, like heterogeneity in market access, in infrastructure, this means heterogeneity in prices of inputs, heterogeneity in prices of outputs, and so of course it's going to imply immense heterogeneity in profits, okay? And so technologies might just not be profitable everywhere, and we're starting to learn a lot about that. It might be hard to learn because I might just have different soil conditions from my neighbors or my friends, and that might make it hard to really take what they're doing and learn from them. And it also limits the innovation spectrum, I think. It limits R&D because R&D ends up having very small markets, right? If this technology is only going to work in this very small geographic space, given population density, especially on the continent, it's hard to see a market for that R&D. And so, the R&D might not be sort of coming out of the private sector in the same way as we might see elsewhere. Okay. So there's evidence on heterogeneity. I've done some work on this. The one thing that's true is the extent of heterogeneity in sub-Saharan Africa is 10 orders of magnitude more in the US, right? So Clausen and Just show, it's a 200%. If I take the 5th percentile and the 95th percentile productivity in the US, the difference is about 200%. Chris and Doug show that it's, 10,000% in Uganda and, on the order of 3,000% in Tanzania. So the amount of heterogeneity just appears to be far, far larger. Okay, and that could be not just natural conditions, but like I said, when you overlay the economics, this adds more to it. Where does it come from? Definitely soil and land quality. Government recommendations are often wrong, and we've learned that over the last several years. Heterogeneity in weather, and this is not going to be just across space, but also across time. And then heterogeneity in access to markets, which people have started working on, also a pretty recent literature. Okay, so what do we do if this is kind of the state of the world on what the world looks like for agriculture and technology? So I want to spend a bit of time on policy. So the how is pretty straightforward in an answer, not so easy to implement, okay? Change the profitability equation for farmers, okay? You need to make things more profitable. And not just for some farmers, for large, large, large numbers of farmers. And how do we do that? Well, we can think about the benefit side. How do I make the technology actually yield more crop? And how do I change the cost side? Okay, how do I change the costs of inputs that I need to make the technology productive? Okay, I'm going to talk about both of those separately. So here's a part of the benefit side. The investments in technology for agriculture are pretty low, right? There's very, very low levels of public and private R&D in the developing world, and even lower in Africa, right? If you look at spending per farmer in R&D, which I won't show you, it's 2 orders of magnitude lower in Africa than in the developed world, okay? Some of this comes from the fact that there's very few ag research stations. If you think of ag research stations, for those that don't work on ag, these are kind of trial stations set up by the government to test new technologies, right? So we're doing something in Kenya with trying to use bacteria as fertilizer, nitrogen-fixing bacteria as fertilizer. The first step was to do a trial with the government on the research station so they can say, yeah, you're not going to kill anybody, okay? And this actually does something useful and productive. Most agricultural technologies start there. They get trialed on an agricultural research station somewhere. There's often a lot of these across the country with the idea to pick up heterogeneity, to understand this heterogeneity. If we look at the number of agricultural research stations, they're both fewer, they have low staff and high turnover. Here are some numbers. For example, in the US, there's about 134 research stations for every 100,000 farmers in the US. These numbers are mostly less than 1 in African countries. Okay, so it's 100-fold less sort of research stations to trial things. These are low levels of investments. They're extremely volatile, and so this makes the problem worse. And we don't see the private sector coming in to sort of replace a lack of public R&D, right? Private R&D is only 1/4 of public R&D, and it's all in the developed world. There's really no private R&D in the developing world. And something we're slowly learning, though less work here, is that agricultural R&D builds on itself, right? The Green Revolution was sort of that idea, is that, if you produce new technologies, it'll build on itself and you'll be, they'll be incentivized to produce more. And you see a bit of this. So for example, in India, there's sort of 20 to 40 new varieties of rice released every year, 10 to 20 new varieties of maize and wheat. In Kenya, it's 5, and it's not clear all the 5 actually do better than the last 5, right? So even though you're producing new varieties, the increase you're getting is very marginal over the previous technology. The other piece that's worth saying is, the ag research stations, and we've documented this pretty well, I think, over many years now. If you get a yield on an ag research station, it's an order of magnitude lower on a farmer plot, on a small-scale farmer's plot. So just because it raises profit, if it raises yields by 10% on the ag research station, you should assume 1% for the farmer. which means basically zero, right? So trying to having a lot of technologies on the research stations that only have marginal improvements means it's not really going to be changing the benefit side of the equation for the farmer at all, okay? So this is something that really needs to change. We need to either think carefully about how we do R&D or how we incentivize more R&D in this space. So what are the options, right? One is you could irrigate, permanently cultivate, terrain engineer, do all these things as much as you can. Of course, that's very costly. That will reduce the impacts of heterogeneity, but costs an enormous amount. The other way is to seek technologies that you can customize or that are profitable across a lot of space. So if you think of the US, there's a ton of customization that goes on. Okay, they customize. The first paper, I think, that I read in Ag might have been the Grillicus paper, which shows this customization, right? He shows adoption, and then he shows sort of a customization across parts of Kansas in the hybrid maize varieties, right? And then you see the adoption take up where it's being customized. You know, think of precision agriculture in the US, big, massive machines that literally can check soil quality in every square meter and apply what they need to apply given those things, right? That's kind of the customization. And we see a lot of that in the developed world. We don't see it in the developing world. There's a lot less customization to local conditions. What does this mean? You know, we can do all the research station trials we want, unless we're involving farmer trials in some way to understand that heterogeneity, we're not going to move forward. So we need a really big use of farmer participatory trials, right? We need to engage farmers in understanding how their conditions affect any given technology, okay? And we need to somehow be able to scale this, right, in a place where infrastructure is not great. Because we will need to understand this to try and understand how to customize in the first place. So trying to do farmer trials across many different areas, regions, times, all of that matters. I think Chris and I go back and forth on whether digital technologies will help or hurt this. I don't know the answer just yet. And so maybe large-scale participatory trials are the solution. It's something we've been calling an era of citizen science. Maybe that's the way to do this, right, is recruit everybody out there to join this agenda. Not an easy thing to do, though. But that's one solution of thinking of this R&D problem. If we're not going to crowd on the public sector, the private sector, maybe we can crowd on citizens to try and help us learn all this stuff and to help us customize, actually. I'll tell you a story about that towards the end. OK, so that's the benefit side, right? I need to solve how to make technologies sort of yield improving for everybody. There's also a cost side, right? I need to reduce the costs of getting those technologies. You know, fertilizer is a big kind of technology that everybody thinks about and talks about and has availability on the continent, but the prices are extremely, extremely high. So these are dollars per kilo across a bunch of African countries. They're, you know, north of some of them reaching $2 a kilogram, right? This is really, really expensive. At this point, whatever yields go up from fertilizer, it's probably not profitable for at least some set of farmers, okay? And so the question is, how do you lower those costs? You could invest in infrastructure. This seems like one of the key pieces of all of the cost profitability sides, right? The other thing you could do is encourage more local production of fertilizer. So there's very little local production of fertilizer on the continent, for example. There's 135 fertilizer plants across sub-Saharan Africa. Very few of those are manufacturing. There's 17. That's not a lot to supply, you know, 60% of the population being in agriculture. It's just nothing. And the market, so most of it is imported. That's what those prices are. You can imagine when the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, what happened to those prices. They skyrocketed. And so fertilizer use, whatever fertilizer use there was, dramatically fell immediately because the prices were so high. The markets tend to be dominated by a small number of importers. And so maybe there's a role for a pro-competitive policy here, trying to think about how you make fertilizer more competitive. You could subsidize fertilizer, and there's now a reasonable-sized literature thinking about subsidizing fertilizer and how to do this. But it has costs, so it has fiscal costs almost immediately, of course. It has implementation challenges in very deep ways. Stefan mentioned the worst of the lot yesterday, I think. But also something that happened also in Malawi was not just corruption, but people will sell it. If you try to target this in any way, of course, if I'm poor, I might decide I just don't need this fertilizer. I'm going to sell it because the money is more important to me. So it has costs, and you might not be, sort of getting it to the people for whom it's most profitable. And then it can create overuse. So there's some work showing overuse in Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. If you subsidize it, if you're not subsidizing nutrients appropriately and changing what nutrients you subsidize, you're going to create overuse. This might over-nitrogenize the soils, which is what's happening in South Asia. And what happens when you add more nitrogen and you've already got a lot of nitrogen, yields go down. Guess what farmers do? They add more subsidized fertilizer, right? And if you're subsidizing nitrogen, which is what they've been doing, you're going to get this degradation in soil quality. And when you add over that the political economy of subsidies and trying to get rid of them once they're in, it's really hard to do. Even when you shouldn't be subsidizing nitrogen in South Asia, it's really hard to pull that subsidy because it's been around for so long. And then the other piece is supporting other inputs like weather insurance that help. Okay, so that's the how. Let me do the last piece, and I'm on time, which is shocking. I'm going to talk about open questions. The really inspiring part of agriculture or research in agriculture has been, there's been so much work. There's just so much work. And I probably haven't done justice to that work. But what we've learned from it is, oh my God, there's so much we don't know. It's really that. I actually stopped working in agriculture for several years. And it's because I felt like everything we were doing was just too small to really change things. And the things that we knew would change things are like, build 1,000 roads. But no one wanted to do that, right? And we knew that would help, but that was the only thing I could see. And I've recently come back to agriculture, so restarting this year. And I'd mentioned we're working with this technology that's a microbe. It's a bacteria that pulls nitrogen out of the air and into the soil for crops. So it substitutes fertilizer. And it's being used in the US and nowhere else in the world at the moment. And the funny thing about the US is the first gen of this technology didn't work very well. It's a genetically modified bacteria so that it pulls tons of nitrogen out of the air and into the crop. And when they first tried it, it didn't work that well. And the co-founder of the company, his parents have a farm in Iowa. And he thought, oh, I'm going to grab some bacteria from their farm, because there's bacteria in the soil, by the way, loads of it, lots and lots of it, and mix that with this and see what happens. And this is the technology that's working. Right, so he kind of customized it to the US by pulling something out of the soil in the US that made this more productive. So, that's the process that I think of when I think of customization. You might need to have some local customization. So we're trialing this in Kenya. If it doesn't work, we might pull bacteria out of the soil in Kenya and try it again. But I've come back to it because I feel like this might be a game changer. It would reduce the cost of nitrogen by an order of magnitude. It has huge environmental consequences. Producing nitrogen, the nitrogen fertilizer production process just for nitrogen is at about 2% of world emissions at the moment. And so if we can substitute it with bacteria, which you brew like beer, you could brew it in your backyard. I don't encourage it. You change that carbon footprint quite dramatically, right? And so we don't get stuck in this trade-off that Esther mentioned, can we grow productivity through getting fertilizer without a carbon footprint, right? You need to get yourself out of that equation a little. Okay, so let me talk about open questions, because now I think there's loads of open questions, and almost many that I'm hoping a lot of you will take on, and there's lots of them. So the first one, shockingly, I'm going to say is, how do we provide incentives for R&D? Right? How do we get people to invest in R&D, especially when it's not just a research station trial and then we go out and we're done, right? I need to customize. I might need to, trial with farmers in Western Kenya, and it's different from Eastern Kenya, and the customization might be different. So how do we provide incentives to both, maybe even to the private sector, but also to the public sector to do this investment, okay? It takes a lot of time. That's the one thing about agricultural research. You don't get results in 2 or 3 months. It takes a good year before you see a planting season. So this is not a short-term investment, right? The second, Or, this is kind of a bit of a step back, but is improving yields the most useful way to reduce poverty? We still don't know that. Is that the right path to reduce poverty, or should we try something else? Can the integration of rural and urban markets provide better incentives on the output price side for farmers? Is there a way to scale down large-scale investments to get more irrigation, more other kind of infrastructure investments to farmers, right? So an example I like to use is coffee mills in East Africa. Coffee mills used to be this huge $100,000 mill that could serve a large number of farmers, except farmers lived so far away when you get to population density in Africa that like only a few used it, the ones who lived closest. So TechnoServe scaled this down into a $10,000 mill and built 10 of those, and of course, then more farmers can use them given population density. So is there a way to think about scaling down infrastructure to be able to kind of do more of it to reach more people given the access issues? What is the role of the state in agriculture? Stefan mentioned something. We don't have a lot of work on this. The political economy around policy priorities of investments, especially large infrastructure investments, is certainly interesting. The political economy around subsidies, et cetera. So I think these are all interesting questions to think about. More to learn about some of the constraints, as I mentioned. We don't have a lot of labor and land work. And labor seems to be kind of this thing that interacts with everything. I think that's all we've learned from the labor market research and some of the infrastructure and land research is that labor interacts with lots of things in very complicated ways that we don't get. There's lots and lots and lots and lots to learn on climate change. How is it likely to affect output in Africa? How will farmers and entire systems adapt to these changes? Are there technologies that can move the needle here, and how do we trial, test, and adapt them to local contexts? So a whole host of questions around climate in very fundamental ways. And then the last is something Jonas mentioned yesterday. What will the process of agricultural or structural transformation look like in Africa? So the one piece of work I did skip was the more macro structural transformation work, Doug, Paula, who was here yesterday, and others. Most of it not based on Africa, and we just don't know what this is going to look like in Africa. Will it involve manufacturing? Will it be services? This is another big question that I think we need to think about very seriously. I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much, and I'll hand over to Elina. Oh, you don't need this.
All right, thank you so much. I like that you ended with the open questions. There's indeed a lot, and really a lot to be done. I think the thing about agriculture, you think you know, and then you start reading and you realize you know nothing. There's a lot to be done. So the respondent to that presentation will be Karen, the first respondent. Karen, your chance.
Thank you. This was truly inspiring and challenging. So a hard act to follow. I'm going to come back to a few things that you mentioned and go a little bit more in detail and then put some additional thoughts on the table. But so maybe, as there was so much happening over the last half an hour, maybe just going back to the starting point for a second. So one of the reasons we talk a lot about agriculture, and this is big literature, is it is still true that many of the world's poor are still in the rural areas, and that agriculture is still close to half of the employment, as Tavneet showed in her first graph, and mostly of that is self-employment, as Oriana also mentioned in the very first talk of this conference. It's also true, and I think that's also part of why many people are looking into this and possibly obsessed with agriculture productivity and yield, is that we know we had one big success story. We had the Green Revolution, which showed the potential of productivity growth in agriculture through technology adoption, leading to growth and poverty reduction and rural poverty reduction. And we know, in fact, so, Tavneet mentioned a bit the idea of should we be looking more at packages? Well, in fact, the Green Revolution was already a package or came from a package, which was, simply speaking, high-yielding varieties and fertilizer. But it wasn't just that. There was also, in most countries that had a successful Green Revolution, a lot of investment in extension, in credit, and infrastructure that went along the way. And so we, the example we have actually is a package. And so, this kind of, this long-standing almost puzzle in the literature that the Green Revolution hasn't had the same type of, hasn't led to the same type of yield gains in sub-Saharan Africa. That said, I think it's actually useful to kind of also remember there are, since the Green Revolution, recent examples of agricultural growth of growth stimulated by agricultural growth and including rural poverty reduction, including in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance in Ethiopia. And I know there's a number of Ethiopians in the room, and of course Alemayehu is coming after me. So I'm clearly not, I am actually going to talk a little bit about Ethiopia, a little bit, and then Alemayehu can correct everything I said afterwards, I hope. So what is the challenge? So that's true, so that we have some success stories, including some recent ones, but as Tavneet pointed out, productivity growth in general has been much more limited in sub-Saharan Africa. And so for the last 20 years, as the slides with all those references showed, there has been a literature that basically started from this idea saying, okay, there is a bunch of, I'm not saying we still say this, but when we started this, we said there is a bunch of profitable agricultural innovations. They're sitting somewhere on a shelf. And if we just figure out how to get them off the shelf and have them being adopted, the problem will be solved. And so hence we started focusing on the constraints to technology adoption. Now, we've learned a lot about those constraints. Tavneet kind of talked about them. There's other reviews that she worked on with Chris, that Jeremy McGruder worked on. The way Alain Dejeanvry and Sadoulin have summarized this literature is kind of saying, well, there's a lot of work on the supply side, on these kind of innovations, trying to get things off the shelf, but also work, including, through Atai, that Tavneet has been co-leading, on the demand side, and can we create incentives from the market to have, to make things more profitable, make innovations more, or technologies more profitable, and have people therefore adopt them. Lots of literature, lots of work, even so this perception that the technology adoption and the quality upgrading often hasn't occurred. Okay, so I'm going to actually focus on open questions, but in talking about the open questions, coming back to some of the issues that Tavneet put on the table. So first, say a little bit more about what do we understand about these, or what do we need to understand more about these technology bundles. But also coming back to this idea of there is a bunch of profitable technologies on the shelf, and think about, well, is that actually true? Are the technologies that we have the right ones? When I say the right ones, the profitable and attractive ones. So that Tavneet hinted at this a little bit, so that's obviously going back to these questions around agricultural R&D. Some of my perspective is informed by having been allowed to look under the hood at the CGR for the last 6 years, and seeing a little bit how that production process of the global public good works. No, a slightly different way, I think, of framing this issue is that, well, maybe we learned a lot about adoption, but maybe we didn't learn a lot about scaling. Right, so a lot of the studies we've been focusing on is programs that are trying to target specific constraints to adoption in local settings for good reasons, since a lot of the problems are local. But then when we're talking about this question about agricultural growth and yield, we're really talking about scale. We're talking about yield or productivity growth at the country level or at the regional level. And so when I think it's useful to think about what are the questions there that we maybe didn't look at, and it goes a little bit to the the what and the how question that Stefan pointed out to. And then finally, I think most of what I will talk about is actually this challenge of the new challenges or the additional challenges that climate change and the deteriorating environment health mean for farmers, and therefore also mean for us in a certain way as we think about their decision making and how that is going to affect their reactions to any lifting of constraints. Now, so the kind of the provocative questions there is saying, well, maybe in fact a lot of these technologies, these innovations have worked, but they just offset the deterioration that was going on because of the deteriorating soils, the challenges in the climate, etc. And so maybe we're kind of thinking of this question in the wrong way. Now, obviously, we don't have that counterfactual. We don't have a world where climate change didn't happen in the last 20 years. Or the environmental health deterioration didn't happen. And so instead what I'll focus on is kind of thinking through the implication of that for, in particular for addressing knowledge constraints, but more general. Okay, so what do we know about bundles? So in fact, in a certain way, the good news is that not just economists are thinking about this, the non-economists also started thinking about this. And so, Chris Barrett obviously is an economist, but led a multidisciplinary panel with one of those things that came out in Nature, where they this is their conclusion is we need more socio-technological innovation bundles, so the combination of technological solutions with social innovations. We already talked about the green revolution being a bundle. A lot of NGOs are actually doing this, but we also are offering packages, but we also know from the literature, the descriptive literature, that very often adoption is partial. So even if you offer a package, farmers may not adopt the whole package. Now, maybe that's okay, and so let me go to a graph. So this is way too small, but what this shows, this is Ethiopia, and this is a bunch of innovations on the y-axis, and then a bunch of covariates that we typically look at, like education, gender, poverty, distance to roads, on the x-axis, and the whole point is that this is green and red, meaning that some innovations, at least in Ethiopia, are going to be used by female farmers and others by male farmers, or by others are used by poor farmers and others by less poor farmers. So in a certain way, one way of thinking of innovations is like we've been focusing on particular innovations in our micro-studies, but maybe farmers consider a portfolio of innovations and are adopting the ones that suit their constraints. And so that's what is I'll come back to this Ethiopia study in a bit. In Uganda, with Luc Behagel and Jeremy Genu, we took a slightly different approach. This is working with ICRAF, one of the CG centers, where they offered a portfolio of 32 different feeding practices to dairy livestock farmers. And what we see there is that farmers adopt depending on their constraints. So they customize themselves. And so, of course, that then is a different way of thinking of bundles. So kind of offering multiple things at the same time. A narrower way of thinking of bundles is what Steve Boucher and co-authors have focused on kind of combining different ways of dealing with risk. Okay, so there's this big question, is the R&D failing? Is the process failing to deliver the right thing? So agriculture is a prime example, agricultural R&D, innovation is a prime example of a global public good. Sorry, the innovation is missing there. And so, of course, Moscone and Sastry has kind of put on the table, like maybe this process is generating the inappropriate technologies. The CGR system was born out of kind of a recognition that this global public good, that you need a system that you need to invest in a system that provides the global public good. It kind of followed the early successes of the Green Revolution, in which the Summit and IRI had been instrumental. And so, those centers are there, have been working since. So it's 15 different centers working with the National Agricultural Research Centers to come up with innovations and then test them and trial them to local contexts, as Tavneet was explaining. Now, we looked at this a little bit. We worked with one of them, IITA, and tried to understand how they were doing this testing and the trial once they come up with a certain innovation. This was for an agricultural practice, and realized a lot of those kind of biases that Tavneet was hinting at. So there's site selection, there's farmer selection in those trials, etc. And so not surprisingly, the yields on those trials will give a different result than on farmers' fields without intervention. But no, maybe, so that's kind of, a concern, but at the same time, maybe if the CG and the NARS together if you think of it as an innovation system, then maybe it's okay that we have a skewed distribution of innovations coming out of this innovation system. And so this graph is going back to that same report in Ethiopia. So we worked with, Chris mentioned the LSMSISA surveys, and so in Ethiopia and other countries coming, we built in measures of innovations coming out of these joint collaborations of the CG and the NARS, and that they believed had scaled. So the researchers thought these things have scaled. So there's 18 different innovations across many different agricultural innovations across different, so from livestock to crop to natural resource management. And so the point of this graph is it's very skewed, as we should expect. There is some innovations that are being adopted by multiple millions of farmers, and it's not just, it's not just crops or it's not just livestock. There is a few of those top ones in every category, and then there's many other innovations that are not scaling. And maybe that's okay, maybe that's what we should expect, and maybe we shouldn't be too obsessed with, some of these low ones not scaling. Or maybe some of the low ones are just kind of going back to what I was saying before, relevant for a subset. Okay. Now, so the LSMSIs are coming back to that. So we do know from that evidence a little bit more about what has scaled and what hasn't scaled, in particular on fertilizer, pesticides, and high-yielding varieties. I'll come back to the high-yielding variety question because there is kind of evidence to believe that the self-report is very misleading, and so we don't kind of know necessarily what is scaled. But even if we look at objective measures, so we can take DNA fingerprinting, build that into these LSMSISA surveys, we very often find not just low scale, but also slow scaling. And so the scaling of the Green Revolution technologies went through the private sector, went through the agro dealers. They had incentives to get this stuff out there, fertilizer and high-yielding varieties. Tessa and Jacob have worked on kind of where this could fall apart, if you can get problems with counterfeiting and input quality. But maybe when we think of scaling, for some innovations, we may need a different theory of change, because maybe this private incentives for the agro dealer is not going to work, for instance, for a clonally propagated crop, such as sweet potato or cassava, where once you have it, you kind of can keep on producing it. So Kyle Emmerich and co-authors have worked on that a little bit, kind of thinking through how do we sometimes you can maybe just providing additional information to the agro dealers. In this case, the flood-resistant rice can solve the problem, but possibly that's not enough when you have latent traits or when the payoff is not the same everywhere. I'll skip the cautionary tale. And so I think there's a big question there, who is the right actor to scale? Because it's not the CG or the NARS come up with the innovations. It may not be the agro dealers alone, because the incentives are not necessarily there. And so then is there kind of somehow a missing middle that we may want to think about? And I think that's one of those questions that we're not very well suited maybe to answer those empirically, but it's worth asking that question. And so what can we then learn from when things have scaled? So this is Ethiopia again, the same graph as I showed you before, but now 3 years later. Now this is not just any 3 years. This is, as you notice, between 2019 to 2022. This is 3 years in which the COVID shock happened, the conflict started in Ethiopia, there was a massive food security and famine in those 3 years. And so and this is the LSMS 3 years later, same households, pure panel. So my expectation was this is all going to have collapsed. Now what we see instead is that, first of all, you see stability, but you also see further increases, quite substantially so in some of these innovations. And so to focus on a few of them, a rapid adoption of improved forages. And so where is that happening? It's all in the lowlands, which is so the pastoralist systems, not necessarily where you expect people to intensify. And then and possibly even more remarkably, this is maize DNA. So drought-tolerant maize, so this kind of from 1/3 to half of the villages now have access to drought-tolerant maize in a period of 3 years' time, and improved varieties up to 80%. And so this is going very quick here, and so something is happening here. Now we partly know what's happening, and Alemayehu knows better than me. The government actively went in both on the maize, and the government and the NGOs went in on the forages. But there's kind of something to learn there, I think, about how that happens. That said, also equally important, even if that's true, the maize that they're using is still 20 years old. It got released 20 years ago. And so all the research we do, or the varieties that are being released to address the challenges of today, the drought shocks, the climate shocks, etc., if it takes 20 years for them to be out there, we still have a big problem. I promised to talk about climate change. I'm out of time, which is very unfortunate. So let me just come back to one point, which is the participatory trials that Tavneet mentioned. So if, Tavneet set this up completely, so I'm just going to make one additional point. So we have evidence that these, even simple farmer field days sometimes work, sometimes not. What we also, in fact, these farmer field trials have been done, participatory trials. The CGR and its national partners were doing this at big scale in the 80s and the 90s, and they stopped doing them, partly because they were considered not to provide a global public good, because they were giving these customized information, and so they couldn't get them funded. But now, if you look, there is actually some recent successes, both in China and in, so the Van Etten study is 3 countries in 3 different continents. But all of those, it's not just one season. You don't just have to wait for one season. It's 3 to 5 to 6 years that these participatory trials are going on. And so I think that kind of goes to the complexity of learning, really, that, the farmers, with climate changing, with pests and diseases all over the place, with soils, etc., and all of this very rapidly changing, the decision-making process has become even more complex. It's complex for us to understand. It's also complex for them. And so in this study with Rashid, we look at one of those trials that was done over 3 seasons, and we follow for 6 seasons. And what we show there is that the initial, the trial itself was profitable. They showed that. On farmers' fields, this was not working, had negative profits for 1 season, for 2 seasons, for 3 seasons, and farmers kept on experimenting and trying. And by season 6, so there's a slope kind of going upwards, and so by season 6, they're still trying, and some now have positive profits. And so I think there is more to learn. There's things to learn for the R&D, the feedback loop, which is super important. I think there's also things for us to learn about farmers learning from those trials. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right. The last respondent would be Alemayehu. Chance is yours. Thank you.
Okay. I was planning to talk about Ethiopia, and Karen took all the slides, so I have to magically change my slides. First, I would like to thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here, and it's also very hard to follow 2 powerful presentations. So I tried to select a couple of topics that would perhaps add value to the conversation by focusing on my CG corner, so to speak. So both Karen and Tavneet talked about the process of change in agriculture, particularly focusing on technology. I will instead focus on a couple of domains that have been of significant policy and research interest in the last 2 to 3 decades. The first is the relationship between, or the linkage between, nutrition and agriculture. And the second is women empowerment related to, again, both agricultural change and nutrition. Finally, I would briefly mention one footnote additional to the list of whys that technology adoption in agriculture, particularly in Africa, is proven to be difficult. Okay, so Pascaline at the beginning talked about this malnutrition. So it's a major problem. Clearly, the trends are downwards, but rather slow. Still, a significant fraction of children in the world suffer from stunting and wasting. And the key challenge is that the changes are very, very slow. And the consequences of these exposure is a significant change in the life paths of those who are subject to it. So it is clearly necessary to look at effective ways of addressing the problem of undernutrition, and that, as I said, have been a major policy concern as well as research. Now, clearly this state of nutrition relates to agriculture, because agriculture produces, in simple terms, produces food. Access to food is an important ingredient of nutritional status. So improving agriculture is one important pathway to improve nutrition. These potential pathways that agriculture could improve nutrition have been outlined significantly in depth, and one can summarize them in 4 pathways. Improved availability and access to nutrient-rich foods. This is the production side. There is the income side, because the greater yield and higher output leads to greater income and higher purchasing power, again, potentially affecting nutrition positively. And supply and demand interactions will be modified by agricultural change, and this would affect food prices with implications to nutrition. And finally, the pathway that is more recently being emphasized is the role of women and their status in both the determination of agricultural outcomes, but also nutritional outcomes of themselves as well as their children. So these are potentials. It turned out these potentials are hard to realize without some active, deliberate effort to link what happens in agriculture with nutrition. So increasing food production in standard ways is not an adequate way of raising and improving nutritional outcomes.